You are listening to the GodArchy podcast, where we shove a crowbar between state and church. This is the spot where Christian faith intersects with libertarian anarchism. I'm your host, Mike Meharry. In this episode, I'm going to talk about decentralizing the state and the church. Welcome to another episode of the GodArchy podcast. Thanks so much for taking a little bit of time to listen. This is actually episode number 10, so something of a milestone for the GodArchy podcast. To mark the occasion, and because this is what I was planning on doing anyway, I will actually be talking with a guest today. I'm going to have my good friend, Jason Rink, on with me. Jason is an entrepreneur, a videographer, a longtime libertarian activist, and a fellow believer. And we're going to talk about the whole idea of decentralization, both from a political standpoint, and also we're going to talk about decentralization within the church. I think it's a really interesting discussion. We're going to lay out some vision that I think people will find interesting. And along the way, we're also going to touch on the issues of war and share a little bit about our own personal journeys in terms of our faith and our political worldview. So the discussion turned out even better than I imagined, and I suspected it was going to be really good. So hold on to your hats, so to speak. I think it's going to be a good show, and you're going to enjoy it. But before I get into that, I do want to let everybody know that I have started a Patreon for the GodArchy podcast. Obviously, I would appreciate any support that you would be willing to give. Doing this takes time and a little bit of an investment. And to do more of what I hope to do, such as write a GodArchy book and expand the show and do some other things, some activism type things, I'm going to need a little bit of financial support. And so that's one reason for starting the page. But I want to do something a little bit different with this. I want to partner with my supporters to reach out into the community and into the world and support people and organizations that need help. So what I'm going to do is 40% of all of the support that comes in through my Patreon page each month is going to be given to an individual in need or an organization worthy of support. And I'm going to do it in such a way that supporting listeners have input into where that money is going. The way I see this working is I'm going to start a special Facebook group for GodArchy supporters, and each month we will put our heads together and figure out, like I said, either an individual or an organization that we can support with some of the proceeds that come into the Patreon. So this is a way to kind of create a GodArchy community that is then reaching out into the world to make a difference. And there'll be some other benefits to being a supporter. I'm going to do some bonus episodes, and I'm going to do transcripts of the show that will be available to folks that are supporters. So check it out, patreon.com/GodArchy. It's easy to remember. Of course, it will be linked on the show notes page. And like I said, I really covet your support. I'm really excited about the idea of being able to create a community that can help other people financially and actually be the hands and feet of Jesus. So please check that out. Please consider supporting us. And like I said, I would greatly appreciate it and would be humbled by any support that you would be interested in giving. So with that said, let's get into our interview with Jason Rink. Well, I am here today with my good old friend. See what I did there? Jason Rink.
You're older than me, buddy. So,
I know, but we're both getting older together, right? We've known each other, what, like 10 years now almost, I think.
I would say that's about right. I think it was, 2010 probably.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too. So tell folks just real quick what you're into now, and then we'll kind of move into some more in-depth questions about your faith and your political ideology and cool stuff like that.
Yeah. So, when I first met you, Mike, it was when we were part of the 10th Amendment Center Nullify Now tour,
Yeah,
I
we're
believe.
gonna get into that.
Yeah. And yeah, great. And but yeah, right now what I'm doing is I run a video production company out of Austin, Texas, and work with, businesses and organizations to produce video to help get their message out to their market, to help build their business, build their brand, and try to, make a bigger impact through video and video marketing. So I've been doing that for a number of years now. And really, that journey for me all started by making a documentary, back in 2011.
Yep.
And so, yeah, that's what I do now. And I'm also on the board of directors for the Libertarian Christian Institute. Sometimes I pop in and I'm a guest on the Libertarian Christian podcast, but I have been a part of getting that organization going with Norman Horn and a guy named Doug Stewart for the last several years. And that's, just another thing I love to do is to be a part of that movement of libertarian thinkers who also have, see the Christian faith and the libertarian ideas as being congruent with each other. We're a strange bird, I think.
Indeed.
So.
Yeah, actually, Doug and I are getting ready to collaborate on either a podcast or an article or both on the whole idea of socialism as being something that is a Christian worldview. There was an article that came out, and we're gonna do something together on that. So that'll be pretty cool.
Yeah, I've probably got that exact article pulled up right now. If you're talking about the one from Sojourner.
Yeah, that's the one.
Man. Well, a side note, but I'll be really interested to see what you guys produce around that. So
yeah, it should be interesting. So you're like a bona fide entrepreneur, right?
Yeah. I started down this path. I was in commercial banking, until about 2007. Well, in 2007 and 2008, I'd been in there for about 10 years. And when the Ron Paul campaign started up in 2007 and 2008, I started to learn about the Fed, started to learn about Austrian economics, started to learn something was wrong in the economic world. And when the financial crisis hit, I was working at Chase Bank, and then I was also like giving speeches at End the Fed rallies. Right. So I felt, it was a bit
a little conflicted there.
Yeah. I felt like I was in turmoil. So I looked to leave the commercial banking sector and ended up having an opportunity to run a brand new nonprofit organization here in Austin, Texas, called the Foundation for a Free Society, which is somewhat defunct right now. It's sort of dormant. But I was a part of that for, several years. And then out of that had an opportunity to go work at a really cool production company called Emergent Order, which is the team behind like the Keynes versus Hayek rap videos many people know about. But I learned, all of the ins and outs of video and media production and sort of the ad agency world there. And then I ended up going out on my own about 4 years ago. And I've been there, doing that ever since. I have a handful of employees and, live the glamorous life of traveling the world.
Right.
But it's been a lot of fun. It's been an incredible blessing.
I saw this thing today. You'll find this interesting because I know a little bit about what you've gone through to make that transition. I know that it's not been an easy one for you and your family, and that there were some times in there you wondered how you were going to keep the roof over your head and the food on the table. But from what I've read from some lefties, and I can't remember what the source of this was, but some lefties will do for our purposes. Entrepreneurs are basically all just rich kids that have a safety net. That's what this article said, that's what
Oh,
an
really?
entrepreneur. Yeah, rich kids with the safety net. So there you go. You weren't really
Yeah.
in any danger there at all, buddy.
Not at all. Nope. Yeah, that's great. Well, I'll be happy. My dad will be happy to know that that's what I was growing up. Was just a rich kid.
Right. Well, he's
but
probably
yeah.
going to be mad that he missed out on all of the benefits of being the rich
Yeah.
dad, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, that's great. Well, entrepreneurship has been a real it's been a real part of my journey as a Christian and as a libertarian, from a standpoint of like it really getting me to understand that freedom, there's so many dimensions of freedom that I think we are in control of, or that we have a say in,
Right.
beyond like the government version of that, So like, my relationships with my family, my financial well-being, like my happiness in my job, all that stuff, I have a say in it. And I got to a place where I said, I really have this entrepreneurial spark. I want to work for myself. I want to have my own business. I want to have more time autonomy. I want to be able to have an opportunity to generate, unlimited wealth theoretically. I mean, as an entrepreneur, you don't have an artificial ceiling
Right.
that you might have as an employee. And as I've gone down this path, it's been really eye-opening in a lot of ways. And it's also really reframed my understanding of capitalism in a Christian worldview, and me really getting very convinced that capitalism, voluntary exchange and markets is just like a miraculous thing that God created in order to generate wealth.
Mm-hmm.
It produces wealth. We're not in a zero sum, system. It's actually an economic miracle, this thing called the markets and this thing called voluntary exchange, and this idea that we can move through the world. In order to enrich ourselves, we have to provide value for other people. So it's this incredible, altruism is from the standpoint of seeking how to make other people's lives better, is actually incentivized in the free market system. So God came up with it, is what I believe, and there are some things as Christians that we should do to be very kingdom-minded about how we generate wealth and what we do with our wealth. But it has absolutely nothing to do with government, and it has nothing to do with taxation and theft. So anyway, it's been great for me. It's really helped to strengthen my faith as well, and just getting me to understand that. As much as I do have a say about something, knowing that if what I'm up to really just resonates and I'm in alignment with it, I know that God is with me, and God is actually the great provider in it all. And I've seen so many places where, I'm out here not in a job. So it's like I don't have the safety net, quote unquote, of a, weekly
you
salary. Yeah, right. Exactly. And yet there's actually a freedom and a safety I feel in it that's even stronger, where I'm like, oh, that was just an illusion anyway. And now here I am, I'm out in the world, and I see God's hand in creating opportunities for me all the time. So it's just so much more clear. Whereas before, the money that was coming in my account, it was like, oh, when I worked at Chase Bank, it was like, oh yeah, Chase Bank is my provider.
Right.
They're always consistent.
Yeah.
It was hard to see God's hand in it a lot. And now as an entrepreneur, and I'm supporting other people, the payroll is kind of big, and right. I'm like, wow, and it's like God's come through. He always does. And it's incredible. So,
it's interesting too, because you are expressing a different way of looking at the world than I think a lot of libertarians do, because I've been in this movement I'm probably not as long as you, but for long enough now to have developed a good bit of cynicism about the quote-unquote liberty movement. And I feel like there's so much pessimism in it. And that pessimism is we've got this giant overreaching government, and there's nothing we can do about it, and we're always going to be enslaved, and this negative mentality. And yet you've just expressed something that is very freeing, and recognizing that we may not be able to control the fact that the IRS is going to pick our pocket, and that's a bad thing, and we can certainly work towards, changing that if that be possible or not. But we do have control over a lot of things in our lives, and there is freedom even within this unfree world, not to get too close to quoting Harry Brown.
Right.
So yeah, I think it's a more positive way of looking at the world, and I agree with you. I've experienced this myself. You begin to feel a little bit more in control, and it's weird because in some ways it's out of your control, but then on the other hand, you really start to recognize where God's hand is providing. So it's a cool kind of thing. So I'm going to give you something to unpack here.
Cool.
That you take as little or as much time with it as you want. But I just want you to share a little bit about your own spiritual and political journey and how those two things have related and intertwined. And you said something that resonates with me, because I went through a real period of kind of self-awakening where I recognized that my political views weren't jibing with my spiritual views and my way of living my life. And you kind of talked about that just real briefly with the bank, but kind of talk about that. How did you get to where you are as a, I don't even know how you define yourself, and you're probably like me and don't like the terms. I've been using voluntarist.
Don't label me, man.
Yeah, man. I like the term voluntarist. I don't like anarchist, because that implies that you're throwing rocks at people, and anarcho-capitalist, well, nobody knows what the hell that is, so I don't like that term. So voluntarist is kind of cool. It's voluntary relationships, but kind of talk about that journey for you.
Yeah. So one thing that was critical for me is, I was a pastor. I was a Baptist pastor for a few years, from 2003 to 2006. I was part of starting a church in Cincinnati, Ohio. And what happened was, once I got out there and I was, like a teaching pastor with another guy, we sort of were the two teaching pastors. I was, developing discipleship materials and things for this church. And what happened is I found myself, I'm out there on my own now. I'm leading a church with somebody else. And I started to just examine why I believed what I believed about certain things.
Mm-hmm.
Like it wasn't enough to just be like a cultural Christian. I just had to go deeper with some things. And this was a time when, in the aftermath of 9/11 and the, war in the Middle East was just starting to really, it'd been going on for, a couple of years or whatever. And as I started looking at it, I started to recognize that I had a inconsistency that really bothered me the more I thought about it. And the way that this inconsistency showed itself to me was I was in it's sort of the mode of belief in this evangelical church around, what happens when it went like this. I'm pro-life, right? So I was against abortion, and believed that, young children who died at an early age, went to be with Jesus. For whatever reason, that's what I believed. And that may or may not be biblically accurate, and that I believe that, aborted children, they actually go into the presence of God. And, that's what I believed. And it's a terrible thing that they would be aborted, because they would never have a chance to have a life on earth. But that was what was happening. And then I had this other belief that, Muslims who were like adults who were being bombed, right, who didn't believe in Christ, that they were going to die and go into a Christless eternity forever, right? And so I started thinking about this whole issue of pro-life and the value of human life and eternal destiny. And I started to get hung up on this idea that, in fact, from an eternal perspective, aborted children go to be with Jesus, but Muslims who are bombed by, the United States go to hell. And I was like, from an eternal perspective, this isn't good.
Right.
In fact, I started getting into this weird logic where I was like, abortion's actually not as bad as war, because in abortion, at least those children are going into the presence of Jesus. It's
Right.
like you can see how like this line of thinking, I was like, man, something's weird here, because I actually supported war.
Mhm.
Like I supported the United States. Like, we're supposed to support Israel and, blah, blah, blah. There was just all of these things from a cultural Christian background that I had inherited. And so when I got to this place where I was like starting to trip over this idea that morally, was it possible that like war could be worse than abortion? And, and why did I support war? And how could I support war? And like, I just started to go into the deep implications of all of this sort of mixed up thinking. And when I got to the other side of it, it was no longer about like which is worse. It was just really like, hey, Jesus is the Prince of Peace. Nonviolence is the way of Christ. And like, it wouldn't make sense for me to send missionaries to a foreign land to try to win souls for Jesus and also support a carpet bombing campaign
Right.
that might be going on in the same place. Like, this doesn't make sense. So I really started to come into an understanding that Jesus had a very anti-imperialist, anti-empire, anti-war, pacifist, nonviolent, streak. In fact, it's not just a streak in him, it's like a defining characteristics. And it kind of broke open for me around that issue. And out of that is when I started to, I started to see what was going on with Ron Paul. It just led me into that. And Ron Paul was saying things that were really resonating with me. And Ron also has like a Christian background. Like he's a Christian. And I was like, oh, this is interesting. So that's where the journey was for me. But it started out of a crisis of faith and belief, of seeing that I had just a massive inconsistency in what I believed about certain issues.
Yeah. You and I had a very, very similar journey, but I kind of did it the other way. I was way farther along in my political journey before I realized that my view on war was really warped. And it's funny because when I'm listening to you talk now, and you talk about sending missionaries on the one hand and then carpet bombing on the other, it sounds ludicrous in my head. And yet I held that very idea without feeling any dissonance for, most of my life, which is really kind of, once the light's on, it's like, oh.
Yeah. And it's for me, it was the result of an unexamined position. Like,
right.
I was politically ignorant and politically uninvolved. I just knew that all the people around me, I became a Christian when I was 22.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So it was later in life. For me, I didn't grow up in a Christian home,
right.
But prior to that, I didn't have any political opinions. So I just was sort of like, yeah, whatever. I didn't care. And then I became a Christian, and I started to notice the people around me were like pretty much Republican. And, it was like George Bush was a good guy and he was like a Christian guy. And I just had an unexamined set of beliefs around politics. And then once I started to recognize that politics, there's implications, there's spiritual implications about politics, and there's implications about life and human flourishing for people. That's when it started to really get sticky, because I was like, well, wait a minute. This isn't just a neutral domain of life. There are things here that impact things from a kingdom perspective and from a Christian perspective. So I just went on a journey to learn, and I was like, well, wait, why do I believe why do I not believe? Oh,
right.
Great. And then that sent me down the journey. So
I'll tell you a funny story, and you'll remember this. And I'm going to talk a little bit about nullification and whatnot here in just a second, but you already mentioned that you produced a video. It's the nullification video, and I think it was 2010 when we went to CPAC. It might have been 2011, but somewhere in that ballpark. We went to CPAC,
Mm-hmm.
and to people that aren't familiar, it's the big conservative convention that's held in Washington, D.C. every year. I think it's actually kicking off here in a couple of weeks. And so we were there. We went to promote and preview, or premiere, I guess is the right word.
Yeah.
The nullification video. Okay, you remember that trip, right?
Yeah.
And there was this joke that you guys were all telling that I kind of jumped in on, but I didn't get it at the time. And it was everything that anybody would say, like all these Republicans would talk about doing this and this, and you would add with bombs. So, it would be like, we're going to let's put it in today's context, we're going to make America great again with bombs, everything was with bombs. And I was like, why do they keep saying this,
Right.
And it's funny now because looking back, I get it, because that really is the mentality. And, really, when you get down to it, I think that's politics boiled down to a nutshell. Ultimately, it comes down to guns and bombs. We don't always see it to that extent. It doesn't always get to that point. But everything the government does ultimately has force behind it. And so it was kind of a funny thing, but it was part of my development of trying to figure out what I had gotten into with these crazy libertarians as I was still early on that journey.
Yeah, and I mean, I know it's interesting because when you're a libertarian for a while, or you have, again, here we are defining ourselves, but when you sort of find yourself in that camp, more libertarian leaning camp, some of the ideas that we have sound really evident. It's like, this idea that if we personally couldn't just try to get somebody to do something we wanted to do with guns or bombs, individually, why can we just delegate a group of people called government with badges or, with uniforms,
right,
and have them do it? That idea doesn't make any sense to me right now. And yet at some point it did. And this whole idea of taxation is theft.
Mm-hmm.
When you start getting into this idea, a lot of libertarians are like, oh yeah, obviously. And it's like, no. It does not occur that way to a lot of people.
Most people.
Yeah. And it's even, on this recent article that came out where somebody wrote a commentary, the biblical values of Ocasio-Cortez's democratic socialism.
Right.
It's like there are people in the Christian, world who think that democratic socialism is very biblical and in line with the Bible. And I'm like, yeah, but the seventh commandment is don't steal.
Right.
So I don't, to me, I'm like, this is self-evident to taxations, theft, whatever. But it's like, these are realizations that come over you over time, and the lights come on,
mm-hmm.
and then it changes the way you see the world. And I think many times that's at the heart of what we need to be up to, is just really recognize that anybody we come across that we're looking to influence towards liberty or towards Christianity, whatever we might want to influence somebody towards, recognizing how it isn't until people have a shift in their worldview that some of these things really click.
Yeah.
And they're things that are self-evident for us that we need to try to have oh wait, well, how did I see this before I believed this?
Right.
So yeah, it is tough to do that sometimes. But yeah. So anyway, I don't know how we got on that.
Well, I think a lot of people don't go. I've used the word journey a number of times already in this interview, and I use that term very intentionally because it really is a journey. I look at where I am today, and I look at where I was even 2 years ago, or certainly 5 years ago, or 10 years ago when I met Michael Bolden. There's an evolution of things, and I think that part of the thing that people don't do is they get to one point on the road and they just stop. And I look at people on the left, and a lot of these folks are very good intentioned. They want to do good things. They want to feed the poor. They want to clothe the naked. They want to do these things, and they see those values in the Bible, but they never get far enough down the road to see that you can't hit people to get it done. And that's what you get into, of course, when you get into government. You're hitting people, you're using guns and force. And so the question is, and I don't know the answer to this, I'm trying to figure it out as I go, how do you help people take that further step down the road? And I think sometimes it's just, revealing the hard truth. I mean, for me, with the whole war thing, the thing that really kind of shook me out of it was something that Tom Woods said, because I had fully embraced the idea that government was stupid when it came to economics and domestic things, and yet I was still walking around thinking that these same idiots could run foreign policy. And, Tom Woods made the comment that these are the same idiots. And I was like, so
yeah, right.
Sometimes you need that kick in the pants. So, maybe that's kind of what I'm hoping that this podcast will be, because one of the reasons I started GodArchy in the first place was my frustration with the way so many American Christians embrace war. And I'm with you. I mean, it's probably the worst moral atrocity as far as worldly things that go on this planet. So many people killed and starved, and we just kind of blasé, oh yeah, go America. And so I really want to shake people, especially people that are believers, that to help them kind of look down the road a little bit and say, maybe the Prince of Peace wouldn't have us be doing some of the warmongering that we're doing.
Yeah, and there's two things that you've touched on there that I think are really critical in this. Number one is when you look at the Gospels, when you look at the New Testament, when you look at what Jesus was up to, number one, it wasn't top down. It was a decentralized, grassroots introduction of the kingdom of God. And it was the rich, the politically powerful, and the religious elites who saw the implications of what Jesus was up to and recognized that their time was up. It was like, oh, we've got a system here that's really working for us. It's called a top-down system of government married with religion, and that's what was going on in that time when Jesus came on the scene. And He comes along, and He's not taking, the students who've been sitting at the feet of rabbis. He's going and getting the fishermen. These are the guys who couldn't, parents back then wanted their kids, Jewish parents back then wanted their kids to be selected to study under a rabbi, and it's like, yeah, there were those guys. And then there were the guys who were fishermen, right? Mm-hmm. And so Jesus is getting those guys, and then He's leading them, and they're the ones who are used to establish the church. Totally decentralized, totally grassroots, totally shaking up, the whole thing. And then the other radical thing that happened was that Jesus upsets the otherness that was so prevalent, right? Mm-hmm. So the us versus them, the pitting groups of people against one another, the Jews versus the Samaritans and all of that. And the division of us versus them, getting us to see different tribes and nations and people as the enemy or different from us, that is totally antithetical to what Jesus was up to. And when you start seeing what happens in the book of Acts and mm-hmm. and what moves forward in the formation of the church of Antioch, like all through that, it's coming to the surface is like, wow, there's Gentiles, there's like African dude, and Italian dude, and all this, and it's like the church represented the bringing together of different people, of nations, tribes, tongues, groups of people who were at each other's throats, that somehow something was being created in this grassroots, decentralized spiritual movement that allowed people to get beyond the things that divided them in the society of the world and then in this world system. And so this whole idea of like war, for example, is built on top-down solutions to problems in the world. We're going to go ahead and have the government do a thing. And it also is based on this idea of us versus them. Me being able to look out into the world and think that the people in the Middle East are like so different from me. And this is really present for me right now. I just came back from Uruguay. Mm-hmm. And I had this experience in Uruguay where I was like, I haven't met a single person here who their main motivation in life isn't like, I'm trying to make my life better, earn some money to support my family so that my kids can have a better life than me. And it's like that's how it is all over the world.
Right.
That's the humanness that we have in common. And once we see that the Mexican who's trying to come across the border for a better life, or the person in the Middle East who's up to whatever they're doing, the who is it that really wants us to see those people as a threat and as an other? That is not from the spirit of Jesus. So I think that is another just critical thing. And I think it's something that when you look at the church in America right now, there's just a general worship of the state. It's an idol that's in the middle of the church that's accepted. And you've got a group of people in America who, I'm not going to say it's racism, because I really don't think most Christians that I've met are actually racist in the way
Right.
that the media is trying to portray this. But there's a fear of the other.
Mm-hmm.
And that's different. It has a lot to do with not knowing. It has a lot to do with just having our insular culture and the not straying beyond the place that we live and the place that we shop and all of that, and our churches all look like us. So there's a lot at play here. So I think that the more that we can get people in the church to recognize that a grassroots decentralized way is the way of Jesus, and that breaking down the walls between me and the other, and to see the oneness in humanity, like that's of Jesus. If we can go to work at working on those on ourselves and trying to see a shift in that in the church, I think some of the other things will fall down.
Yeah, absolutely. So you've kind of swerved into really what I want to be kind of the core of this conversation. I'm going to set it up a little bit first because you've completely blown my ordering of questions apart. So, which is kind of what I expected. That's cool.
Yeah, right.
I mentioned before, and I'm just going to give folks a little bit of background, that you and I actually first met and became friends through this thing called Nullify Now. And for people that might not be familiar with this idea of nullification, it's a political idea, a principle within the U.S. constitutional system that state and local governments can actually take action to stop unwarranted overreaching federal power. So at the core, this whole idea of nullification is really about decentralization. And without getting into constitutional history and philosophy, which you and I both know I could do for hours, but
yeah, absolutely,
right. But the American system, as it was originally founded, was a decentralized system. Most of the decision making and most of the authority was meant to be at the state and local level. The federal government was meant to be very small and limited. We flipped that on its head. This whole idea of nullification is a way to try to reorder that and reorient the system back to what it was intentionally meant to be. And you made a fantastic film about that called Nullification. We did these Nullify Now tours. I'm still working with the 10th Amendment Center on this activity. So I think a lot of people in the church, especially who have that conservative kind of Republican background, are nodding their heads very fast. Yes, this is great decentralization, And you said something that really struck me. Actually, you posted it on Facebook. I'm going to read a Jason Rink quote. You said, "The decentralization of the church is underway in America. The centralized model is collapsing, and a distributed model is going to rise up in its place. It's going to be a grassroots movement led by lay people who stop waiting for permission and take the Bible seriously, that we are priests and ministers of the church." Man, there's a lot to unpack in that quote. I agree with you, and it's a lot of really good stuff there. First off, what do you mean by a distributed model?
Yeah, so let me do something quick and just see if I can anchor this a little bit into the segue that you made. So one of the things that I noticed when we were doing the work around nullification, which is rooted in federalism, this idea of, local and state, trumping federal government, and that being the initial, way things were set up. We were doing it when Obama was still in office.
Yeah.
So the message tends to resonate with the people who are out of power at the time,
Mhm.
because something's happened at the federal government, from the that the Democrats are doing, and it's the Republicans who are like, yeah, can't we just not obey that? It sounds like a great idea at the time. Well, now things have shifted,
Oh, yes,
and
they have.
now Trump's in office, and this idea of nullification has gotten more traction with some of the more progressive states.
That's absolutely right.
And we were talking about the progressive ideas, even when Obama was in office. Like we really see this as a nonpartisan issue.
Right.
It's something where it's like, no, this is the way to create greater human freedom and flourishing.
Mhm.
Is to have everything that happens at the local and state level be more, the more personal issues are handled there, and very few issues are handled at the top level. Well, that whole concept, and a lot of things that when we look at the federal government and we see how it fails to do a good job, because it's like this top-down model that sort of breaks down, right? A lot of people can recognize things that the federal government doesn't do well, and it
Right.
breaks down. Well, for the last 10 years, I would say I've been on this journey in my faith journey. When I left the ministry in 2006, there was a number of reasons for that. But when I left, I started to recognize and see aspects of the way that the church was oriented in the United States, and I just started to see how it has become very institutionalized.
Mhm.
And I started to ask myself, like, wait, was that how it was designed? And I've actually got another comparison that I want to make that might help to solidify this a little bit more. Another journey that I went on in my life was the journey to homeschool our son. Our son's 19 right now. But when he was born, me and my wife started asking ourselves, like, well, how are we going to do this? Did the research, and I was like, man, we should think about homeschooling, right? And that idea back then, was even more radical than it is now. It's become more accepted now in the last 19 years. But what I found was that in this whole space of institutional schooling, is that we've got this thing called institutional schooling here in the United States, and it's what most people do. And if the goal of institutional schooling was to actually educate and cultivate the soul of the individual to find the work that's important to them and fulfilling, and to be a value in society, it's done a terrible job at accomplishing that.
Yes, it has.
Right. And there's plenty of people who will say, that's not the goal of it. The goal is much more nefarious. It's to make us into automatons that don't think. And wherever you fall on that, institutional schooling is not generating the kind of educated people, that we'd like to see. So homeschooling is an alternative. And many of us in homeschooling, we just want the freedom to do it a different way that we think is going to be more effective and have a greater impact and lead to the results we're looking for. And in that journey, what I found was really interesting was a lot of times it's people in institutional schooling, like parents who still send their kids to institutional schools, and teachers who are part of institutional schools, they feel like threatened by homeschoolers.
Right.
It's kind of like we've got the audacity to do it this other way, and it's like what I'm doing is not impacting them really in any way. I mean, there's a couple of ways you could argue, but overall it's just like, hey, look, we're just going to do it our way and you do it your way, and we think our way is like better for us. Well, it's a very, very similar thing that I've come across in this idea of the decentralization of the church, the distributed model of church, and a trend that I see happening out there, which is the collapse of the institutional model of the church.
Mhm.
And what I want to point to is a couple of things. Number one, I believe that the institutionalization of the church really happened in, like 300 AD.
Yep.
With Constantine, or maybe that was in the 400 AD. It's in that general vicinity.
Right.
That's when the institutionalization of the church began, really. Prior to that, it was a distributed model. It looks a lot different than it looked right now. and as we went through the next 1,000 years or whatever, like it pretty much was that way. And then the Reformation happened, and what happened there was a bunch of regular people got their hands on the Bible,
Mm-hmm.
and they said, wait a minute, some things aren't adding up here. And the Protestants broke out, and but they really hung on to the institutional model of church still.
Right.
There was still really a priest class and paid clergy, and the people get together, and it's sort of a audience speaker type thing. What I'm going to call it is the epistemological approach to church,
Mm-hmm.
which is all about learning and knowing. And in fact, it really closely mirrors the way that we approach institutional schooling. So institutional schooling in America is all about learning a bunch of things that we can repeat back to demonstrate we have mastery. We don't really have mastery. We can just repeat it back on a test. We know the answers.
Right.
And what I've seen is that in America, what we have now is an epistemological model of church and disciple making. Most of what happens in disciple making is epistemological, meaning it's just about learning and being able to repeat back the right doctrines.
Mm-hmm.
It's about learning information. It's a 3-point outline, that, how to live a better life. But there's not really the transformation of being happening, changing me into something different,
Right.
like as who I am. And this is a big question you've come into, but what I started to see was that the institutional model of church with that's oriented around an epistemological gathering, which is a teaching opportunity, it has created a situation where the community aspect of church has been very minimized, where my ability to step up into one another in a meaningful way with other Christians, where we can come together and really share what's going on in our lives, like it's just been very minimized, and it's been
Right.
so centered around this teaching model. And as I started to dig into what was going on there, I started to see that there's some movements happening around the country that's really like this unchurching model coming up. And what's also happening is through technology, it's become less important for us all to get into a room to hear a message.
Mm-hmm.
And it's less important for there to be a building in the center of town that we can all gather in. Like, the ability for us as believers to connect with other believers locally or nationally, and the ability for us to have access to the best teaching that there is in the world, it's at our fingertips. So technology has changed the accessibility in the same way that the printing press put the Bible into the hands of the common person. Like, the best Bible teaching you could ever want to have is at your fingertips because you can get it no matter where it's happening in the
Right.
world. What can't we get that way? It's the life.
Right.
It's
Community.
It's the community. And so I also recognized that the incentive structures of the church, I've talked to a couple of mega church pastors, guys who have sort of moved in this direction with me. The big secret is most churches are spending 80 to 85% of all the tithes on overhead.
Mm-hmm.
It's salaries, it's
Facilities.
buildings
Mm-hmm.
that aren't used hardly ever, right? Just part of the week. And it's like, I started to look at that and I was like, that's kind of like government, really, guys. Like, it's like we're all sending all our money to a central place to have 20% of it, go out into the world and like meet real needs. And listen, we can have another conversation about like what happens on Sunday, and that's important, and people's lives getting saved and everything. And so I'm not saying nothing that happens there is worthwhile, but I don't think it's efficient, and I think it underutilizes the myriad of powerful gifts of people that are sitting around not finding a place to serve. Because frankly, in many of these types of churches, the only place you're going to find to serve is you're going to help park cars, you're going to help put away chairs, you're going to be an usher, and you're going to sit in a children's ministry. And I think there's way more power like pent up in people. And so I've seen this, and I believe that this distributed model that's coming is that I believe that we are going to see the breakout of what will essentially be house churches or community groups that are led by entrepreneurial leaders who don't need to take a salary, right? They're entrepreneurs who have more time and money freedom, and that we're going to find ways to deploy financial resources in a more efficient and impactful way towards kingdom purposes without sending them through this filter that's going to take 80% of it away to handle a bunch of stuff that's not super important. So the distributed model, part of that I came to see through my understanding and experience with cryptocurrency,
Right.
which was this idea that you could have a distributed network of churches and people gathering in groups of 20, 30, and 40, and being connected through technology, potentially even using things like cryptocurrency to directly give and support throughout all over the world in different ways that we want to, in a costless fashion, frankly. And that distributed model more closely mirrors what I believe Jesus set up and unleashed when he was on the planet, and it's a lay led, by entrepreneurial leaders who will be connected and interconnected through technology to create a distributed, network of churches that are going to move the ball forward. So that's my pitch, man.
Well, it's interesting because one of my best friends is a missionary in Kazakhstan. And we've had almost an identical conversation. And of course, he's coming, there's some differences because he's coming out of that institutional church. He's a Southern Baptist missionary, so he's doing Southern Baptist mission work. But the way they are doing church in Kazakhstan and in Uzbekistan and in some of these countries where he's working is very much what you're describing.
Yeah.
It's not a big church in the middle of town. It's 15 or 20 people that meet in homes, that share meals together, that help one another in very tangible ways because they're living in much more difficult situations in terms of their living conditions, in terms of poverty, almost by necessity. They can't have the big institutional church. And he is really sold on this concept because of the community that is developed among these people and the way it reaches into the broader community, because other people say, hey, there's this group over here and they're helping each other out and they're loving each other and they're living a different way. We're interested in this because this is obviously something that's positively impacting. You talk about human flourishing. They see that and they want to be part of it. And the witness of that is growing the church. Now, the danger of that is it'll become institutional in and of itself. But, this is happening just organically in other countries and other places. And I know a lot of people are really, really sold on it because they're seeing that. I mean, it's not that there's not teaching going on. I mean, they do Bible study and whatnot, but there's so much more to it. There's much more of that in-depth in community. But I can hear the naysayers, and I'll let you address this and then we'll close it up. But, don't we need the church hierarchy? Because without it, if we have all these lay people, it's going to destroy orthodoxy, and we're going to have all these people believing the wrong thing. How would you respond to that objection?
Yeah, and I mean, I think that number one, like this could lead us down a whole road of talking about whether or not denominationalism. I think it was John Wesley, ironically, who said like denominationalism was like a great was like from Satan. Like I don't have the quote handy, but it
That
was
sounds like something John Wesley would say. He was not one to mince words.
Yeah, and it's like the hyper the church is very sectarian in America. Like we have all these different denominations, all these different sects within sects, and like sectarianism is never one time mentioned in a positive light in the New Testament.
No.
And so when we talk about like if we don't have this hierarchy, how do we make sure people believe the right thing? It's like, hey, look, when we look at the church right now in America, all we got is a bunch of different small denominations saying they believe the right thing. Like, and we're arguing internally about a bunch of things nobody really cares about that much outside of our little sects.
Sounds like libertarians.
Yeah, exactly. It's identical. And it's like, meanwhile, like you and I could pick up the Apostles' Creed and we could look at that and you and I can be like, oh yeah, we believe those things.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, I can do that with most anybody I run into who's a Christian, who's a part of a sect. And it's like, hey, we all believe this, right? Okay, so it's like this larger unity around the core tenets of the faith,
right?
There is an orthodoxy that's been handed down for centuries, and we actually all kind of agree on it.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is, and this I think goes back to the difference in, I would have listeners here investigate the distinction between epistemological and ontological training because I think this is really at the heart of it. I think at the heart of when you look at how God decided to deliver his message to mankind, he didn't send a book.
Right.
He sent a man.
He sent Jesus.
He came in flesh to dwell with us and to demonstrate a way of being and to show us how to live. And then the Bible is written to point back to Jesus, right? And so it's like it shows us that. And we've mistaken learning about the Bible and mastery of knowledge and making sure that we know what every verse means, that we've not been transformed by it. And I believe that this epistemological obsession of like making sure that I have the whole Bible figured out is why now we've got all these sects that we all think we have cornered the market on truth. And now the world at large. So, should babies be baptized, or is it just the elect, or is everybody, when's the rapture and no rapture, end time, all that stuff? Like people who aren't Christians, they don't care about that stuff, number one. Number two, all they see is a bunch of people who argue, right? When what they're looking for, what would transform and invite the world into what we're doing? And I think they've seen the institutional model. They're not appealed to. It doesn't appeal to them. I think especially the next generation that's coming up doesn't appeal to them at all. But what would be amazing was what if there was a small group of friends and that they had a personal connection to somebody there. And in that home, there might be like a Donald Trump supporter and a Bernie Sanders supporter, or a person of a different race, people from different races. And they've all gotten together. And because they're centered around, this thing called, the orthodoxy that we agree on. And again, I say the Apostles' Creed's probably about as boiled down as you can get it for me.
Right.
And it's like the miracle is to see the unity that could exist in a group of people that actually don't agree on everything.
Yeah.
And what if you had people that are currently in different denominations who are in community together? And what we didn't spend our time talking about was whether or not I'm right about my pet doctrine, but like manifest it. Me and you figuring out how we can be genuinely transformed to walk through this world as the pardon of God in the image of Christ, and that I wasn't just over here struggling to sort of manage my sin. I'm really in a one another relationship with a tight group of people that we are just that family is stronger there than in my blood. That's what I see
Yeah.
in the New Testament. I don't see that in the institutional church. And I have had naysayers who are like, this does exist already. You just got to look for it. And then I dig deeper, and they're all have got a sect that they want me to try to that they're really trying to get me involved in. It's like, oh, I got it. You guys have the corner on the truth. Everybody thinks they have the corner on the truth. And I think what I have to say here, or what resonates for me, and why this kind of how this bow all gets tied together, is like in the same way as a libertarian, like the non-aggression principle, don't hurt other people, don't take their stuff.
Right.
That's the thing. Once we get beyond that, it gets kind of complicated, and we start developing sects, and we start saying certain people are in or certain people are out.
Yeah.
And listen, I used to be a King James only Baptist, like dispensational, like I can tell you all the end times, and I could almost date set it, right? And I'd be wrong, of course. But like I used to see the coming together of different sects of Christians as like a terrible ecumenical thing that would, shouldn't happen. And something's changed in me over the last several years, where I've recognized that when Jesus talked about what the world would see in our communities, it was a supernatural love and unity that couldn't be explained. And that requires a diversity of people, a diversity of beliefs and understandings, and us having to deal with our human stuff together and overcome it. And I was like, wow, that's really something. And so I see it sort of that way. It's like we've gotten caught up in a lot of minutia. And the last thing I would say is that I believe that the institutional church structure and leadership is disincentivized to do what will be necessary for the bride of Christ to be revived and powerful in America in the way that I think it can be. Because the Sunday service is the thing. It's the center of all of the marketing and the spending, and it's the reason that a lot of people have jobs in the church. And if you would make the communities that are led by, lay leaders, the center of it all, and that it would be the occasional sort of gathering of a multitude of these small churches together. Every 3 months we have a big party together where a super talented preacher and a big band and all that happens. Then you start realizing you don't need the building 365 days a year. You don't need the people on staff. Those people could actually be more impactful, creating value in the economy in different ways, and still being a missionary to their culture. So that's what I see, and I would encourage anybody who's interested in talking about any of these ideas to reach out to me, because I'm really loving the conversation right now about this. And you can find me on Facebook at Jason Rink. Love for you to connect with me, friends who would listen to GodArchy.
I'll link to that. I'll link to your Facebook on the show notes page. So the one thing that you said that resonated with me, and we'll kind of wrap it up with this kind of final thought. But you're talking about some very similar things that I've been recognizing in my own walk over the last couple of years, especially when you're talking about belief. Because I've got the belief down, and it was funny because I walked away from my faith for about 4 or 5 years in the early O's. And it was funny because during that time I had a friend that was an atheist that I worked with, and she and I would get in religious debates all the time. Now, mind you, I was pretending like I was an atheist at this point too, but I would still argue with her. And I could argue her into the ground because even though I wasn't walking in the faith, I had the belief down. And I've really realized over the last couple of years, it's been a growing feeling in me, and that's part of why I'm doing GodArchy. It's that the belief it's important. We need to understand, we need to know. But Christianity isn't about checking off a list of beliefs. It's a relationship with Jesus Christ. It's being part of his kingdom. And being part of his kingdom means that we are literally his representatives in this world. We are his hands and feet, as they say. We are his kingdom. So it's about doing. It's about being peacemakers. It's about loving your neighbor as yourself. I can believe that I should love my neighbor as myself, but at some point I've got to start loving my neighbor as myself and developing that community. And I think that's something that I've hungered for. I don't need something else to believe. I think everybody has things that they can believe. We want that genuine love. We want that community. And, you know, I've come to realize that the kingdom of God is here now. I was one of those people, and I think this is prevalent in the church today. We see the kingdom of God as this thing that's going to come later. You know, it kind of halfway came maybe when Jesus was here, but it's something that's in the future. We're going to go to heaven, and there's going to be a king. No, Jesus said it is finished when he died on the cross. When he rose from the dead, that kingdom was established. So that means we are in the midst of a kingdom of peace. We are in the midst of a kingdom of reconciliation. We are in the midst of a kingdom of love. As his citizens, as the people in that kingdom, it's our job to bring that into existence and make that start to be real in this world. And I really feel like we all need to try to live our lives in such a way that we're reflecting that kingdom, as opposed to just, you know, making sure that we've got a bunch of people that can check off a bunch of beliefs on a list. And, you know, again, I'm probably going to get the nasty emails about, oh, well, you don't have the right orthodoxy. And, you know, maybe I do or don't. But I'm just convinced that this is all about something that we need to start to live out. And, you know, that's why I'm opposed to war. That's why I'm grappling with the idea of wholehearted pacifism. I mean, even going beyond the non-aggression principle and just trying to figure out, how do I live the way Jesus lived in this world today? So what you said has resonated. I really appreciate you taking the time to chat. I know you're a busy, busy man out there entrepreneuring. And so I appreciate you taking the time out to chat with me. I think people will get some value out of this and hopefully be challenged.
Yeah, man. Well, I appreciate the invitation, dude. You know I love what you're up to. So thanks a lot, Mike. Had a good time
talking
about it.
All right. Well, we'll talk to you again sometime. Peace out, brother.
All right. Take care, man.
All righty then. Well, that is a wrap for this episode of the GodArchy podcast. Episode 10 is in the can. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Jason. I really, really do appreciate you taking a few minutes out of your day to listen. If you want to support GodArchy, you can do that through our Patreon. It's patreon.com/GodArchy, and on the page you will find all of the information that you need about the benefits of being a supporting listener and how your partnership with GodArchy will also help other organizations and individuals in need. If you want to contact me, you can do that. Just email info@godarchy.org. So thank you again for listening, and I will talk to you again next time.
You have been listening to the GodArchy podcast. You can find us on the web at godarchy.org. You can also connect with us on Facebook at GodArchy.org and Twitter at GodArchy. GodArchy is a Little L production. Make sure you check out the other shows on the Little L roster, including The Gold Standard with Alan Mosley, The Sherry Voluntary Show, Postcards from Somalia, and for all you armchair quarterbacks out there, Sports Ball with Mike and Alan. You can subscribe to the GodArchy podcast at iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play. Thanks for listening.
today.